The context I want to talk about, and in a way it follows on from Paula and Terry and indeed Paul's contributions. We stand in the context of major challenges and crises and opportunities. The one I like to use is the idea of a triple crunch in terms of the financial, economic, climate change, and in particular the issue of energy insecurity. And I think in keeping with the two previous speakers, this is a tremendous opportunity to rethink our dominant views of the economy, and particularly to inject some politics and ethics, but particularly, and I'm going to be talking about, is unearthing the already ideological and normative nature of the orthodoxy that's already in existence. And in particular, to end the absolute fiction that economics is a value-free zone, or that somehow objective and scientific. Again, myself and Terry didn't coordinate, but I use a similar term, that the emperor has no clothes. And again, in partly relation to the article by Krugman, but the one I pick up here is in terms of even those who were from within the orthodoxy are beginning to see that the system they created looked fine on paper, but actually didn't, do anything in terms of the real economy. A bit like often the English or Irish football thing, great on paper, crap on grass. And we need to get real. Or as we say, Greenspan has his own particular take on this, absolutely shocked what's going on, or a phrase from my father's in the audience, we're in a jocker. And I do think we need to start demystifying the economy. Saying we're in a jocker is as meaningful and as politically important as anything Greenspan or anybody on irisheconomy.ie or many of the media commentators we have on the economy would actually say. And of course, it's only when the tide goes out do we realise who's naked. This is what I think the orthodoxy is actually doing to the natural world, the ultimate basis upon which our economy is based. This relates to what Terry was talking about in terms of ecological economics. But the emperor has no clothes. There's lots of fancy equations, lots of econometrics and mathematics. I mean, it's true to say, and I do say this deliberately with a feminist inflection, that the mainstream economic system suffers from physics envy. It wants to be a hard science with lots of figures and facts that are indisputable. But the reality is, it's as ideological as any of the alternative economic systems that Terry outlined: feminist, Marxist, socialist, green, ecological. And I think we need to be aware that it is the political ideology of the dominant perspective that informs public policy. In fact, it's not just enough to say that the dominant orthodoxy of neoclassical economics is the language of power or the language of public policy, including, I have to say, and this is with a tip in the direction of the trade union movements, in terms of even there seems to be a particular hold of this neoclassical model. And the point I'm trying to make is that this neoclassical model is not just the language of power, but it's the grammar. Now, controlling the grammar is much more important than the language. The grammar are the rules by which a language is used. So that gives the neoclassical orthodoxy a tremendous amount of power, to the extent that even challenges to public policy have to be expressed in the same language, the same format. I cannot express against a road that's going to go through a valuable ecosystem, or Tara, to take an example. It's very close to my party's heart, although despite what's happened. You have to express it in terms of, well, what's the quantitative economic monetary value of that? Non-monetary qualifications are not permitted because of the economic orthodoxy. So I think now more than ever we do need to start reinvigorating economics to be about political economy. It always has been. It's been a fiction for the last 50 years that somehow we have an automatic, objective, scientific, value-free approach to the way the economy is actually organised. And again, no correspondence, but great minds think alike and fools seldom differ. The economy is too important simply to be left to economists. And the point I'll be making is, what would an economy look like that was designed by a scientist or somebody with an awareness of the biophysical realities of the world? I suppose the main point I'm making, just to emphasise, and I suppose many speakers today will be making this point as well, is that the orthodoxy doesn't just describe the world, tells us how the world is. It's actually prescribing the world, telling us how the world ought to be. And already, therefore, it is normative, it is political, it is a project to create a particular view of the way the economy actually should be. And to exaggerate, but then as I say here, exaggeration when the truth loses its temper, it seems to me that the orthodoxy has been in the same position as the neocons or in the Bush administration. You read this here from a New York Times article from a few years ago, which I think accurately reflects many of the wilder imaginations or sense of power of the orthodoxy. They create reality. And that's the power of this particular orthodoxy, which is actually seeped out from the academy. And I'll talk a little bit about a campaign, and a friend of mine in the audience here, Neil from Cork, is involved in the Toxic Textbooks campaign, which I'll talk about in a moment. Have a read of it. This is a sticker you can download from a wonderful organisation called adbusters.com, a Canadian activist group, to stick on Begg, Fisher and Dornbush, for those of you who still probably shudder at those undergraduate economics 101. This is where the rot sets in the production and reproduction of an ideologically biased account of the way the world actually is. You look at any economics textbook, a 101, basic economics textbook, the world doesn't exist, as in the natural world. There's producers and consumers in a nice, lovely circle. Women don't exist. The work that goes on in the informal sphere in the home doesn't exist either. It is presenting us not with a description of how the world is, but actually creating a fiction of how the world ought to be according to this particular orthodox view. And what I'm going to do to start beginning to outline a green or ecological approach to the economy is to question in particular something that Paula had mentioned in terms of referencing Tim Jackson, that he's the UK's Economic Sustainable Development Commissioner. And he produced a report which is about to become a book called Prosperity Without Growth, and basically arguing what Greens have been arguing for the last 4 decades. Or you can go back even further to John Stuart Mill in his Principles of Political Economy, talking about the idea of a stationary state. That there's a point beyond which a society needs to stop focusing its efforts on economic growth and starts looking at more qualitative measures of well-being and development. The orthodoxy is committed to economic growth. Under one of the traditions that Terry outlined in Marxism, it's capital accumulation, profit-making based upon a private property system. From a Green perspective, growth for its own sake has a number of flaws, and I'll outline some of them. One is that it's a substitute for economic equality. The orthodoxy is, so long as the cake is growing, it doesn't really matter about your proportionate share. You're better off than you were last year. But as we know from numerous studies, anecdotal evidence, but particularly the one that Paula had mentioned, the Wilkinson and Pickett book, The Spirit Level, wonderful piece of statistical analysis, showing that economic growth acts as a substitute for a greater equality wherever you actually look at it. So the idea, if you're an egalitarian, or God forbid a socialist, or somebody who wants to be progressive, if you want a less unequal society, growth ain't going to deliver it either nationally or indeed internationally. So this is not to be taken as an argument against growth anywhere in the world. Growth is needed in the developing world. We live in the minority world in terms of the West, the industrialized nations. Growth in our society means a new form of iPhone or brand of pot noodle. Growth in the developing world can mean a sanitation plant, a necessary road being built. In other words, the difference between attending to luxuries, artificially created luxuries, often based upon our own insecurities, as opposed to seeing where growth is about needs meeting, keeping people alive and giving them a decent standard of living. Again, this is why Greens often don't get elected, because of telling uncomfortable truths. The fundamentals, what are they like? Without seeing that the ultimate fundamentals is a reminder that everything we make in the human economy, maybe with the exception of credit default swaps, is fundamentally based upon the natural world and the biophysical resources and flows of energy and biophysical natural capital. And it seems to me it's a logical argument. It's not even ideological. How can a subsystem, the human economy, how can it possibly be on a path of exponential, i.e. every year increasing more and more, when with the exception of solar radiation, the planet is fixed in terms of its resources and energy? It's rather like a balloon in a box. How can the balloon keep on growing within the fixed parameters of the larger system? At some point it's going to have to burst. This is an old argument that goes right back to the early 1970s, for those of you who perhaps remember, called the limits to growth argument, or sometimes called Malthus with a computer, in terms of some of the analysis there. But the reality is, given the embeddedness, the ecological embeddedness and dependence upon of the human economy upon the natural economy, or human capital and natural capital, if you want to use those terms, we need to change our economic model. We need to re-embed the economy within ecology. I mean, particularly, we need to stop treating the planet as if it's a business going into liquidation. When we liquidate biophysical resources and call it income, we compromise life-supporting and life-sustaining systems across the planet, and we call it growth and progress. This system seems to be absolutely mad. It's rather like sitting on a branch, and with each saw that you do, it's progress. We're actually sawing, we're unraveling the ecosystems and capacities that sustain not just our economy and human life, but actually other life forms as well, in terms of extending this out beyond simply humanity. And the reality is, Mother Nature is a tough woman. She doesn't do bailouts in the way that governments do when it comes to the human economy. And already, for those of you perhaps may or may not know, we already now have more climate change and environmental refugees in the world than refugees from wars and famine. In other words, this is not some future prediction. It's already happening. Climate change is already beginning to bite. And of course, it's the most vulnerable in the world that are the ones that are going to suffer the worst as a result of it. And in particular, I keep asking myself the question, why has it taken an economic recession to start seeing CO2 emissions in Ireland reduce? Or less pollution of our water courses? What sort of system have we set up whereby it takes us to get into economic instability, to threaten a macroeconomics that delivers well-being, for us all to get to some sort of reduce our ecological stress on the planet and indeed our local ecosystems? So part of what green economics is, well, how can we actually begin to create a sustainable economy which delivers well-being for all in a way that doesn't compromise these natural systems upon which all economic activity is ultimately dependable? This is what we're up against. It's a form of ecocide. Neoclassical economics is attending over a model and a system of disconnecting the economy, as if the economy somehow is existing quite apart from the natural processes of energy, of resources. Often it's a model that's actually divorced from the biophysical realities of human beings. It's almost based upon a fiction, Homo economicus, of a single man who can work 24/7 without any rest. So we have fictions in our neoclassical orthodoxy based upon a divorce between the biophysical realities of the natural world, and I would also say against those human dimensions of what it means to be human in terms of our own internal nature. But what would an economy look like if it did respect biophysical realities, if it took into account those natural laws? And I have a quote here from an ecological economist, Herman Daly. He's actually former chief economist at the World Bank. And you see there in terms of international trade, well, why not just swap recipes? This makes economic sense. There's a profit in here for somebody. And of course, there's jobs being created. And that's a big issue, I think, when it comes to trade unionists and the trade union movement taking on board some of the lessons of this particular approach to the economy. Is that this is what we have to start attending to. Those wasted carbon miles that's causing CO2, that's then causing climate change, makes economic sense, but it's absolutely ecologically, and I would say socially irrational. And it's something we need to start integrating into our thinking. And again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning in terms of questioning monetary measurements of how to take an account of where the economy is at, we've got to start thinking about measuring stuff. Hectares of arable land. How much biophysical resources do we actually have in terms of water, in terms of energy? And it's interesting that the French, even before Sarkozy commissioned Amartya Sen and Stiglitz to do this analysis of new alternative indicators of macroeconomics, they were pioneering satellite accounting, and Australia now are doing it, of actually measuring stuff alongside of measuring orthodox GNP. Because the danger in just measuring things in orthodox GNP is that you can liquidate stuff, give it a monetary amount, and that adds a positive. So we have to start thinking, I think, in terms of a much older tradition of political economy. So we may or may not. It's sad that in our academies of teaching economics, we don't actually teach a lot about economic history, the origins of economics and political economy and Adam Smith. But the system I'm referring to, or the system of thought, is again from France, and there might be a French theme here emerging, of the physiocrats. I'm not saying everything they said was correct, but they did have a handle on the importance of measuring stuff. Real quantitative measurements of the real fundamentals, as opposed to simply giving a monetary value. But here I'm making a pitch to progressives, particularly, as I say, the trade union movement, because I'm using an International Labour Organization report from 2004, that we need to start thinking about replacing an imperative around economic growth as the overarching consensus of what an economy should be aiming for, and start replacing it with more nuanced views of things like economic security. And particularly, just to pick up on some of the themes that Paul left us with, in terms of fear, preventing anger, moving to action, I think that there is an attitude and an appetite out there for a discourse of security. Now, living as I do in Belfast, I don't mean that type of security. I mean a sense of security that a young child feels being held in their mother's arms. And call me a bleeding heart liberal if you want. Yes, I am a bleeding heart liberal. I like to think that as progressives we can hold our tender views in tough ways. So we need to start looking at alternative ways of talking about economic security, which I think will have resonance for people out there who are feeling fearful and indeed angry. And in particular, if you want to talk about an economy aimed at enhancing well-being, income after a certain point actually undermines well-being and quality of life. For most of the comparable statistics I can see, it's in and around between $15,000 to $20,000 per person per annum. Beyond that, then, the correlation between growing GDP and reported levels of well-being, it starts to break off the relationship. So I think there is an opening now in this crisis in thinking about the economy, repoliticizing our debate about the economy, of looking at what would an economy that would look like if it not only attended to the biophysical realities of the world, but also was aimed not at increasing GNP, which even orthodox economists accept is not a good measure of economic well-being, but actually measured economic well-being. Public policy orientated towards enhancing well-being and quality of life, as opposed to increasing foreign direct investment, enhancing our international competitiveness, and all the other nostrums of the neoliberal model. And a particular follow-on from that point of looking at an economy organised around well-being and quality of life is studies we've already shown. This is the first one is a report from the UK Cabinet Office, which they tried to suppress in 2005 under Tony Blair, which verified a second report from the Swedish Environment Protection Agency that showed, beyond a certain point, consumption, more and more consumerism, does not add to quality of life. I mean, in a way, it's stating the bleeding obvious. We know, whether you take in terms of obesity, we've only got one stomach. We know beyond 2,000 calories a day, which is the recommended World Health Organization number of calories we need to keep a normal adult healthy and functioning. We know that beyond that, it actually starts to have a negative impact on people. And then to go back to almost 40 years ago, over 40 years ago, of why GNP needs to be dethroned along with neoclassical economics as a way of measuring the well-being in society. It would have been better for me to add to the Republic of Ireland's GNP if on my journey down from the north I crashed into every car I could come across, divorced my wife along the way, because all of these things add to GNP. It's an indiscriminate measurement of the goods and the negatives in our society. We need to have more nuanced understandings and measurements of the economy. I mean, there is some signs of hope. This recent report from TASC, I think, is beginning to open up a debate around shifting, although they still talk about sustainable growth, which I'm not still quite sure about, because in my view, our orthodox commitment to economic growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. That's what cancer is. Their normal healthy cells, past a certain threshold, then become pernicious to the body. And I think we are now in that position in terms of a commitment to economic growth. It's becoming cancerous. We've had a social recession for the past 4 decades, often known as the crocodile graph, where you see GDP going up. Yes, we've had a few ups and downs, but reported levels of well-being have been bumping along, not appreciably increased in the last 40 years. So we have an economy going up, the trends are going up, but our reported levels of well-being and so forth are bumping along. This seems to be like a truth that dare not speak its name. The economy is not delivering in terms of, if you're interested in equality, if you're interested in quality of life, orthodox economic growth ain't the way to actually do it. And just to finish up, I do think we are now searching for a model beyond, this is not a term of mine, it's from Colin Hines from the New Economics Foundation. The old model was buildings, banks and boutiques, property, finance and consumerism. We need to find what's the alternative to this. If we are not to go back to, as Paul said, the business as usual, what is the alternative? And I would like to think it's got something to do, a step change to transform our economy to a low carbon green economy, green collar jobs as opposed to buildings, banks and boutiques. I mean, you need to also remember that economists are asked questions, orthodox economists, Brian Lucy, all the rest of them, all those austere 46 economists wrote that letter to the Irish Times, not because they have the truth, but because they're asked. They are not scientists that have the definitive analysis. They are the orthodoxy. They are the seats of intellectual power. That's why they are asked. And therefore, the battle we're engaged in, for those who are against that orthodoxy, is an ideological battle. It's not just a battle about the econometrics and the nuances. It's actually an ideological battle of hearts and minds. And in particular, it always struck me as a rather obvious point, we don't accept one model for how the polity should be organised. We want democracy there, we want debate, we want pluralism. Why the hell should we accept one model for how the economy is organised? If we want to live in a pluralist society, and indeed problem solving comes out of pluralist debate rather than an orthodoxy, acting in a rather autistic fashion, thinking that doing the same thing over and over again is going to produce a result. So I think maybe an alternative to buildings, banks and boutiques is my own concoction of libraries, laundromats and light rail. It's got to do with ideas of socialising and collectivising consumption. Yes, with due deference to other beardy radicals like Karl Marx. They did have a point. I mean, if we're socialising risk as we are now, and as my party will be debating over in the RDS this afternoon under NAMA, well, why not collectivise and socialise other parts of the economy? Particularly not just in terms of production, that was the old Marxist view, that socialised production. What about socialised forms of consumption? And I think libraries, laundromats and light rail represent indicative forms of socialised forms of consumption, which actually have a much lower environmental impact. They also have the other added benefit of enhancing social solidarity, as opposed to working against it if you have a private car-based system and so on. And I do think we are, and again, this is with deference to why I'm on the Marxist lentilist wing of the green movement. I'm what's known as a watermelon green on the outside and red in the middle. Well, I'm a former sticky, so that's where that comes from. It does seem to me that we are also going to see, if you want a sustainable green economy, we're going to have forms of planning, not Stalinist 5-year plans, But the anarchy of the market has palpably failed upon its own account. We're going to need forms of planning, but particularly forms of planning which we're not even used to yet, which may involve planning for energy descent. And that's a phrase we're going to get very used to in the coming decade as peak oil begins to bite. Unless you want nuclear power, it is absolutely the case that renewable energy cannot replace the energy density of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. So we have to start looking at how do we organize an economy, how do we spatially plan for our settlements in a world not just with renewable and nuclear energy, but less energy. The upside of this is we waste such a tremendous amount of energy. But that's a different, that to me is the level and the scale of the challenge facing us. And it's not even on the radar. Climate change is on the radar of most governments, with the exception, and of course I would say this as a Green, Eamon Ryan is the only European minister to admit the reality of peak oil. Debates differ as to when it's going to happen, but when Eddie Hobbs says it, don't believe me, Eddie Hobbs has said it, this is a reality. This is going to increasingly frame our transition to a low-carbon economy. So I think we need to move, as I said there, from maybe Marxist-Leninism to Marxist-Lentilism. So, thank you very much.